Which games out there are generating the most sales or revenue, and is mobile a sustainable place for new studios to be founded in? So this is topics I used to speak more to as a consulting person. These days I'm mostly training people who are earlier in the stages than trying to consider studios. But there's a question that came up recently inside of Home Team that I wanted to address with a video because I recognize that it's a great question that comes up a lot, that a lot of people out there have confusion about, or nothing else I can offer a lens from my experiences and connections to. Now, speaking of which, when I'm speaking to this, it's really kind of informed by different points of reference. So for one, I had a best-selling iPhone game in the early iPhone era, which, as I'll get to, has changed dramatically from 2008 to 2010 or 12, still releasing titles closer to 12. But out of those, right, I had a top 2 paid game that was developed by only 2 people for a, let's say, high 4, low 5-digit budget, keeping things approximate. 2 people, most of the core development team, plus an art studio, plus a publishing layer, as we'll talk about, super important there, that was well-connected and well-funded, without which I don't think it would have been top 2 paid in the world at the time like it was. Separate from that, we've also had a couple games in top 25 for Action Arcade, had a top, I think it might have been role 6 position, top 10 in any case, for educational app on iPad. So I had a variety of titles, right, not just a single one, but a variety of titles who ranked up in early iPhone stuff. And so because of that, so that's one source, my own personal experience, though it's, and I'm putting a big asterisk there, from longer ago. I've also kept in touch with a lot of friends through that, right? So one of those titles I made was an Indiecade finalist, and then through that I became the Indiecade alumni lead and speaker organizer. So for many years I've been meeting other people who have stayed in mobile space or indie game studio runners, and just kind of following how's their work shift, how is the kind of games they're building, what platforms are they building for, how has that changed? That's been an element. And then just also it's been sort of the podcast that I run where every single month I'm reaching out now since 2015, speaking to another developer about what they've been doing, what their approach has been, what advice they have for others. So it's also sort of triangulating against newer examples. And so let's kind of wrap all this up into, they're going to kind of lead to a path that I've seen often work, and I'm going to speak to maybe why there's this additional layer that might not be obvious from the outside. So first of all, when I was getting new into the iOS market, right, and people still think about this sometimes, like Super Monkey Ball did great, Trism did great, just kind of every single game that you could see seemed to be doing pretty well. It was kind of, for a little while, if you made a game, it did pretty well. Or so it seemed. They could charge more money for them, and basically just releasing on the game got a decent amount of attention because it sat in that new filter, and there weren't a lot of games yet on the iOS market. Now, of course, part of what changed, now basically there's 2 kind of things happening there. One is iOS was so new, iPhone was so new, people were basically, Apple wanted to sell the games to help sell their platform. They wanted to show off that our games, or our platform has games on it. And this is true for any new platform, right? When VR platforms were new, Oculus had an interest in these things. When Switch was new, Nintendo was more interested in these things. As a platform matures and it's had more time, and the App Store has been around for a while, the Google Play Store has been around for a while, basically that pressure is removed from the company, the main platform holder, where Amazon doesn't care if they sell your book. They just care if they're selling books, right? Steam doesn't care if they sell your game. Steam cares about that they're selling games, and ultimately they're going to spotlight what's most successful because their platform stays afloat by getting a cut of selling the things that people are buying. Now, modern day, we fast forward a bit, there are literally, I think, 500,000 games, depending on which numbers you look up and which are qualifying as a game, 500,000 games or so currently on mobile platforms. And again, plus or minus. Now that's, I'm saying currently because a lot of games were released and then since taken down. They didn't update for the 64-bit Switch. They didn't update for the iOS 4 OpenGL changes or whatever. So those are removed. Otherwise, we're talking about literally millions of games in the past 10 or 15 years. Now, out of which, if it's not in the top 10 or top 100, think about this. How many of those games do you know? Do you play? Does a friend of yours know or play? Right? For many of us, it's kind of the same small core handful of, I know a few of them, and it's probably the same few my buddy knows about. And that's because they're partly once they're in that space, that top 10, top 25, top 100, it's fairly sticky because being in that list helps them stay there. That's where people are finding their games. As soon as it's out of that list, right? We're talking like position 101 or below, out of, again, 500,000 titles. As soon as it's outside of there, people only find it really if they're actively searching it out or if they happen to listen to a curated channel that recommends it. And this is where, out of that top space, there's sort of a few different titles we see up there. There's things that are heavily funded by big companies, right? So EA titles, Ubisoft titles, Zynga titles, stuff that Tencent's behind one way or the other in some cases. And in those cases, obviously, they're also leveraging existing IP, existing brand value. Customers recognize that game title, that character, the Star Wars affiliation through Disney, or what have you. That helps their positioning. In other cases, well, you do have a few kind of smaller meme-like winners in that space. And this is, again, as people someone has drawn to those as examples of it seems like it was a minimum development cost to build that kind of crummy little indie game. But those tend to still have at least one viral moment that helped them get there. So maybe PewDiePie or some other major streamer, YouTuber kind of showed the game, got people stoked about it, and that may have helped it catch. But even then, many games that had that kind of opportunity or had a brief window very quickly fell off the curve and didn't stay there. Another dynamic that happens in that top market space is because there is so much money to be had for the companies holding those positions. There are literally stories in the background of big companies buying up the AdWords to drive up the cost of their competitors who are trying to dethrone them from those spots. And so it's a bit of a money fight from companies that have a lot of money coming in that they can spend to help them stay there. So two things are happening there, right? Where when they have that amount of money to kind of like fight off the competitors, unless you have a partner who has a lot of money, and so this is where, for my case, for my top 2 iPhone game that was paid, it was through a well-connected, well-established publisher who could participate in the money fight for that position. That makes a difference. Otherwise, you're kind of showing up in a way that you're very likely to not stick, or at least have a lot of other things working against you. And the other part in there is that when it is a other game that finds a way to stay there, or even push its way up there, there's a lot of paid user acquisition. And for people not familiar with what that term means, it quite literally means that they work out a business model where they're running ads on Facebook, on Twitter, a pre-roll for YouTube, whatever they can do, so they can spend X to acquire a user. And they figure out whatever their cost might be, X dollars and cents per person using their app who installs it. And then in order to make that model keep turning, they have to find some way to build a business model into their game, into the design of their game that can cover the cost of the user acquisition. Until they can do that, they're just burning money, throwing money into a volcano to crank their numbers to try to get closer to that top 100 to be able to stay there. And so if they don't have the deep money pit of an investor or publisher or something else to throw into there, A, they have less of a chance to fight their way up there, but B, it does result in adapting the design of your game, the kind of game you're making, to be the sort of thing that could pay off that cost of user acquisition. And so two effects of that are, one, it might not be the kind of games that you personally feel like are your strengths or interests to develop. It's not inherently a good or bad thing. There's people who hate those kind of games, people who love those kind of games. What I'm saying, though, is that if you as a creative person, as a business owner, as an engineer, aren't interested in the types of games that can sustainably thrive in that space, well, it's not that no one else thought to make a platformer on it or no one else thought to make an FPS game on it. It's that those business models worked better for selling a product on a shelf or a download on Steam or on itch or otherwise, as opposed to what really works for that cost of user acquisition model. The other thing that's happening, right, when you're paying for users, even if they're bringing back some return from their buying in-app purchases or they're subscribing or they're doing some other kind of mechanism that they can buy into, in those kind of cases, it's also shaving off what seems like profit. I mean, it's still profit, right? But it's subtracting the cost from it. And there's much a closer razor margin than it might seem from the outside of a game might be making a lot of money, but reinvesting as much of that back in as they can to trying to bring in more users to help keep it grow even more. And that's just a part of that machine at which managing all that becomes usually out of the scale of a smaller indie company. And again, there's smaller examples, there's counter examples out there, but as a whole, this is where if you browse the titles in there, except for again, a couple of mimetic ones that kind of had their lucky shining moment and found a way to stick and stay, a lot of it's big players with a lot of capital behind them, not really doing it cheaply. The other thing you also see in there, and this is, so we had a guest on our podcast some months ago who was talking about, he works at a larger company that makes smaller games, and basically it's hiding the fact that it might look like this game was minimum development cost. Doesn't have a lot of art, doesn't have a lot of animation, doesn't have a lot of complexity to it. But what you're not seeing is that there's two effects happening that are not cheap. One is a wider base of data-driven experimentation. They're literally producing tons of different prototypes and releasing those in parallel, and then tracking user activity and retention and return values and so on the server side to figure out which of these to double down in. Secondarily, there's a years of iteration effect where the funded studio continues to develop and shape, okay, out of these different experiments we baited into the water, we kind of threw our fishing line out there, these are the ones getting bites, let's double down and polish and experiment and do some A/B testing on where should this go next to make it even more profitable for us. And so even if the project that you see that surfaced into the top of that 100 seems like it wouldn't have been expensive to build, the expensive part was figuring out that that was the thing to build. And this is where an important caveat, right? When you're looking at what kind of game to build, I mean, A, it's platform specific. So obviously I'm speaking here to mobile. And again, there's certain affordances that platform and that demographic tend to have different from other kind of platforms. But think about it, right? It depends on your core strengths as a team or as your connections may have as an individual as well. For a team that might be great for making a VR game might not be so good at making a mobile game. My company might be great at making a mobile game, might be a bad fit for a PC strategy game or a browser game or something else of some other kind of different format. So partly to play to your strengths, but then there's another dimension, right, of aesthetically in terms of design direction. What is the right thing to make? And it's a moving target, because you have to figure out the answer to that question. You know, are people going to care about pirates? Are they going to care about vampires? Are they going to care about street racing or what? Not when you start the project, which is what you can see in the market space right now, but when your game's done. 5 months from now, 2 years from now, 6 years from now, you've got to kind of guess your target for when the game is done. And to the best that you can make an informed choice right now, in the present, from looking at trend charts, from reading forums, from checking the slate of what Hollywood movies are going to have dozens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars thrown into marketing, getting hyped about space battles or something. Every other well-funded competitor is navigating on that same data, right? So if you think that around the corner, the big thing is going to be Wordle variations, so does everybody else, right? That's not knowledge you somehow are privy to. That is something that everybody is simultaneously looking at and being like, can I be the next one of those? And so I'm not saying it's a bad decision or it shouldn't be taken. I am saying that there is not competition you see yet, because there's a tidal wave in stealth who are driving from the same data. And at some element too, it's an industrial art, and we sometimes forget that art side of it means that it's a bit like trying to predict what song is going to be a hit this summer. And it's separate from, even if the song's really well played and performed and sang, it doesn't matter if it doesn't happen to strike a chord with culture at the time for what people want. And this is part of why, another caveat here in sort of like sustainability of mobile and why I worked with a publisher many years ago when I was doing commercial game development. Most games never recoup their costs. And this is not unique to mobile. This is not unique to indie games. This is not new. This predates the indie game boom. So I don't want to get too specific into the source because he was a higher up at a big game publisher at the time. But basically, even before the indie game stuff blew up, he was talking about how like there were years where they'd have like, say, maybe 800 titles for PC games going to shelves. Out of those, really think seriously, realistically, out of the 800 some titles, how many of those did anybody you knew talk about, buy, care about, or did you play? Right? And again, it's like I referenced earlier, it's probably kind of the same handful as everybody else, which doesn't say it's not worth competing in, but it does mean strategically, you've got to be very calculating about expecting you'll have some hits and you'll have some misses. And so big companies, giant companies, right? And this is your Ubisoft, your Activisions, your EAs, things like that. They're managing the risk internally by counting on our few hits are going to cover the costs of our bets that just didn't pan out. And that's working from the best data they can, from the best talent they can recruit, from the best everything that they can do. Still just doesn't always pan out. But they mitigate the risk by trying to have a smart portfolio that the hits here can pay for the failures. This is where the publishing layer, strategically, when it works well, and caveat here, publishing means many different things to many different people. It also can involve QA testing and localization and other kind of services and support and distribution reporting. The part I'm talking about here is where when the layer for publishing works out well, and this is the same way that book publishing works, the same way that music publishing works, the same way that I would assume film publishing, but I don't know as much about that one. In many cases, because the projects lose money, the fundamental deal of interest between the publisher and the developer is that if the game completely flops and never earns back its cost, the developer was able to stay in business. They were able to keep the lights on. They were able to survive another year. They had some guaranteed money from the publisher, again, depending on the type of arrangement that's being constructed. In this kind of case, advances, maybe being recouped by earnings, where they paid the developer to help finish this game or port the game or take it to the next level for Switch or something. And if the earnings eventually exceed what they paid for it, what the publisher paid the developer to make it, then they get a shave of the profit. The developer sees part of the profit, right? And so the publisher, the bet that they're taking is that this game is going to be such a hit that they're going to get to keep a part of it and benefit from that in a way that's going to offset their failures. But it's them trying to mitigate that in a way that if you're a small studio, and I think there's an old Klifsky blog about, for him it was even like 1 in 7, and he's an experienced game developer with like decades of experience building games commercially, professionally, very capable technically, very capable in business, very well connected, very familiar with the platforms and all that kind of stuff. Still, 6 out of 7 of his games lost money, and then 1 out of 7, which you can never predict exactly which 1 out of 7 if you could. You wouldn't make the other 6 necessarily. Those are craters. Didn't make back the money. Or maybe broke even, but then didn't pay you back for your time, remembering that your time is worth something too, if only from opportunity cost. So, going back to the core question, right? Okay, if that first game's not going to be a fail, if that first game's unlikely to be a big hit, then am I saying you just shouldn't do it? And absolutely not. Okay, I want to be clear about this. This is not a doomer, fatalist, whatever. This is putting some asterisks why strategically that first project, or the first projects even, they need to fit in a bigger context, right? You're not building just a game. If you're trying to start a studio, a company, a business, that game needs to fit into a longer arc, a longer strategy. Is it about, this is how we establish our foothold in this genre? This is how we start getting attention from the kind of players and building a list of contacts and customers who want to buy games like this on this platform that we know how to deliver better than anybody else? Is it about building team muscle memory so that we've done some VR stuff together so that now we're better positioned to do future projects together? Is it about informing future developments from real customer feedback? So like I mentioned, the company does a lot of experimental releases. It might be, you know what, honestly, we're not totally sure what the market needs right now. We're going to try to do some things to figure out what we're hearing and then have that inform our action and take it back to servicing what our customers need from us. It's a very real part of business, and running one, it may be different than what you have in mind of, I have a vision for a game I want to exist. Another version it can take, right, is to position your company as a serious candidate for partnership opportunities. So just an example, and I'm just saying VR because obviously it's a thing that off and on has been flaring up and down recently, is something where, okay, well, if we released a game that works on all major headsets for VR, whether or not that particular game did great, we've shown we have the technical proficiency to pull that off, and we understand the challenges that can help you navigate the cost and time estimates and whatever of doing that. So if your company's considering a VR port, maybe now you're interested in working with us because we've done that. We've proven that we can do that. Whereas other people who are maybe trying to hit up the same company for that deal think they're capable of it, say they're capable of it, believe they're capable of it, might be, but haven't demonstrated that that's a thing that they can do. And obviously another version of that, establishing that you should be taken seriously as a business partner, is that when I talked about that publisher layer, a lot of what happens, right, is the publisher's also trying to mitigate their risk. They don't want to fund 100 games and have 99 of them lose money. They want to fund 5 games and have as many of those earn money back as they can. And a lot of how they mitigate their risk from their side is that they would like to see evidence that you have traction, that you have a track record. Maybe it's that you've got some awards recognition for an earlier title you did together when you're starting out. Maybe it's that you got some press attention. You can show IGN's writing about us. Maybe it's that you've got success on a different channel or the same genre in a different platform. So we made a, mobile game or web game that people are really responding well to. What if we brought that to Switch? Now a publisher's interested in having the conversation because you can show we have this many active users. Is it something that maybe you formerly held a position at established businesses? This is a way that can also lend some credibility of, they love to see it when someone who's a part of that picture used to do network engineering at company they've heard of, used to be a CFO at company they've heard of. Those sort of things are what helps get the publisher some confidence that this is a bet that's calculated for a decent chance of return and not just a shot in the dark of somebody else out there who says, hey, I did some tutorials, trust me to do this. But those are the things that set somebody apart as a serious, realistic candidate for a publisher deal or for a collaborator deal. And this is where, when you're trying to find a potential collaborator for a commercial project, they also, right, want to see that you didn't just come up with the idea yesterday morning, waking up and deciding maybe we should run a game studio. Even if you can afford to pay them. You might think, well, if I can just pay them, then who cares? They would like to be a part of a project that does well. They would like to be part of a project that releases, so it doesn't leave a black hole in 3 years of their resume. They would like to work with someone who they feel is a competent, trustworthy, demonstrated, proficient person in communication and coordination, so that they don't get unreasonable, unrealistic, awful requests and just have a bad life of dealing with you. And so their confidence comes from, okay, well, what have you done yet? Are you at my level as a commercially relevant, experienced person who's been paid to do this, art, animation, sound, music, whatever, writing, various kinds of engineering work, business side work? They want to see that you're at least as capable and fluent and ready to work with them. So I suggested earlier, and this is the important part, it's right, building up to, there's sort of a vague arc I can paint here about what steps 1, 2, 3 might look like. And I'm saying this partly because it's the blueprint that I followed and the kind of work that I did commercially. It's one I've seen a lot of other technically oriented founders aiming for. By technically oriented, I mean the people who are at heart programming background, comp sci degrees, come from a world of built some freeware jams or other stuff as our foundational skill. Strategies may be very different if somebody basically decides, I don't program, don't want to program, don't care to program. Different people run businesses differently. I'm speaking to technical oriented founders, which different pros and cons tend to come with that in our network and so on. But the way I've seen other small studios loosely along these lines proceed, right? And so it begins from, at minimum, you do need to establish some fundamentals. And this is where you're following enough tutorials and paint by the numbers examples to get a practical bearing on the basics. So even if you might eventually be mainly aiming to be a producer or an executive or a manager, orienting other people's work, it helps you to have a lens of familiarity of how the different pieces fit together and what's going on there, so that A, you can better assess when someone else says that they can do something, is it relevant to the way you want to do it? And then B, also just in understanding the implications on planning and collaboration between why someone else needs some other thing from some other person. And it's why if you can't just stumble into the space with no idea what's going on, it helps to have done some of those things. Now, having done those tutorials, taken some Udemy courses and watched YouTube tutorials and how to use, Unity certification or something, that's generally not enough yet to get a job someplace or to be taken seriously as an experienced commercial collaborator, because there's no demonstrated ability yet to accomplish any objective outside of following exactly what a video showed you how to do or repeating an answer that you were trained in for passing a test. And so that's a starting point. It's a necessary point, but it is usually not sufficient. And that's where the next layer comes in, right? And the next layer is where you're practicing and demonstrating your ability and finding collaborators. And this is, I tend to find these two fit well together. For some people, they're two different stages. So you might see this as 2A, 2B. I tend to have them happen at the same time. This is the sort of thing we focus on in Home Team. And this is where you're doing enough to build a strong case to potential future commercial collaborator that what you're doing is a worthwhile opportunity to be taken seriously, right? That you have done some things beyond tutorials, beyond solo stuff. And this is also why, when I say beyond solo stuff, because it's as important here to demonstrate that I can work well with others and that I can foresee a bigger project than just I can do every single line of code I looked at and read and know, because that's what you're going to be doing on a commercial project, right? It's not likely to be just a solo thing. It's going to be something where you've got other people working with you, and they need to see that you can work with others. There's a whole bunch of people in the world who they can make a good model, they can write some good code, they can produce a good song, but if they can't work well with others, the game's not going to come out and no one else will work with them. They need to see that you can successfully, repeatedly, in a variety of different contexts, get things done with different people. So those soft skills are as important here to demonstrate and practice as the technical ones. But again, it's also relevant to be able to display those technical skills beyond what you learned from your tutorials, to be able to show that your stuff really stands apart, that your capabilities, your design sense, your positioning, you have some advantage why you're the right person for them to work with rather than somebody else hitting them up for their time and that kind of thing. Now, the reason why I say this can also double as finding collaborators is because in the process of just trying to demonstrate and practice and hone those skills on I can make things and they will come out and we can navigate the certain uncertainty and challenges together. In the process, you're trying on a lot of shoes to see which fit. You're having a lot of trial and error working with different people to see how'd this go? Do we get along? Do I coordinate well with them? And this is where we've had some examples from Home Team, not a whole lot, but some examples in Home Team, as well as examples from both of the college organizations I founded that run comparable, similar, simpler model to Home Team back in 2004 and 2010, where basically people would start by building freeware together and in the process identify like, oh, I really like the way this person works. I really like the way that they think. We really jived when we worked together on a project and riffed on it, had a lot of fun, came out great. There's potential here. Maybe we should kickstart together. Maybe we should take a prototype and polish it further together. For some people, they find this through game jams. Especially if they're like high-ranking results in game jams, and they kind of find each other like, oh man, I was number 4 and most fun. You're top 3 in audio. Like we should probably get together and try something out sometime. Another thing is where some people find in game development university programs and the studio labs where they're building big capstone projects. Again, it may not be that capstone projects goes anywhere commercially, but it might be that in the process they figured out that this designer works great with that engineer, works great with this sort of planning person. And so that is where basically they're proving that they can go beyond the tutorials, that they can work successfully with people, and they're making stuff, and the stuff is real and it gets released, but its primary purpose is positioning them among others, among their peers, and that kind of thing. This is also where I want to stress, right, not everybody necessarily ever shifts gears out of that, changes from that, advances from that. Not everybody wants to, right? So there are pros and cons to taking it up another level to commercial studio. The advantage to kind of staying at that recreational level for self-enrichment is even though the games won't be as polished, they're never going to be as finely detailed and juicy and those kind of things. What they can be is you get much greater creative freedom counterintuitively because you don't have any costs to recoup. You don't have as much at risk. You don't have people's salaries depending on this game selling a certain number of units. It's just, hobby recreational for fun, for learning, for stretching. It means that you can go outside your primary skill area. So even if I'm not mainly an audio person, I can make sound effects in hobby games. Even if I'm not mainly a level designer, I can level design in hobby games. It's also something where many people, they kind of just enjoy the process of building games and they don't want to think about a huge chunk of the time being on business administration, on marketing considerations, on various other bits and pieces that can very easily chew up 25 to 45% of a business's time and energy on just running a company correctly and operating, as opposed to when it's freeware, low risk, you can make a game, make a next game, make a next game. And so that's where a lot of people who I know who've kind of chosen to maybe stay at the stage, stay there, and are perfectly happy there. So again, I want to stress that it's not like an automatic or implied that either you have to go up a level or that you're a failure if you don't. It's not everybody chooses to. But this is where, if you do, and this is where stage 3 commercial project or studio building kind of begins, this is where you've got those potential collaborators, right? Or other people you reach out to, you've got something to show them to say like, hey, I saw your portfolio. It's pretty awesome. Check out some stuff that I've done. I think we should work together. And you've got a basis for that conversation to start from beyond, I took a YouTube tutorial, right? Or I can use Unity, or I know C++, which, okay, congratulations to a lot of the people. Why is working with you going to lead us somewhere worth going, right? If you're the captain of the ship, which is what you're often doing if you're the one contacting them, I need sense that this is going to go somewhere worthwhile and it's not going to just get lost or turn into a mess. And so that's where you've got the evidence for that, in addition to perhaps some core collaborators, again, for people maybe you've even worked with together during that kind of more practice stage, stage 2, figuring out, you know what, we already got someone doing audio. We've already got somebody else helping out with databases. We already got somebody else helping out with, I don't know, could be anything. Could be animation, could be art, could be writing, could be whatever other pieces. You found someone who really works well with. You might still have some gaps in your team, people you didn't find from that exploratory practice demonstration phase. But the fact that you already have 3/5 of a team, 5/8 of a team, or some fraction figured out makes it that much more appealing to someone else to see how they could fit into that. And what the skills are that you brought in of a team that already works well together is, again, a stronger case to a potential collaborator that you're reaching out to from a cold contact than if you, again, just sort of like, you know, start emailing some people and say, hey, would you want to do this? It's going to be a tougher sell on the many different things hitting them up that this can be taken seriously and where you're coming from with it. But that's where things are really start getting serious about legal overhead, company formation, higher costs. You're more likely to be paying directly for acquisition of assets and skills and time and effort, and might be managing business partnerships in one form or another. This is something that is outside the scope of, for example, what we do in Home Team, but it's something that some people are aspiring to do. And so that is something that, again, I want to kind of show how those pieces, 1, 2, 3, kind of fit together in a way. Now, broadly speaking, I also want to mention that out of the companies that I've seen manage this that are smaller game dev companies, by which I mean they are not at the mercy of outside funding, right? They didn't fundraise through venture capitals. They didn't. Basically, they have the freedom to build their things they want to build them. The way that they stayed afloat and maintained their runway was that they basically juggled contract gigs, business to business or B2B work, where some other company has predictable payoff on a predictable timeline. If you can port our thing to this by this timeline, we'll pay you X. If you can help us fix this bug that's blocking our issue, we'll pay you Y. And it's finite money, it's predictable money, it's not as much money, you won't get a hit out of it, you likely won't see a long-term royalty on it, but what you can get is the ability to kind of keep paying the people to do the things that they're doing, including yourself, to be able to prioritize this. And then that's where there's often a shifting ratio over time. And this is an example I draw from Jake Burkett. He's one of our indie game dev career trainer people who helps more advanced Home Team people who've crossed some milestones. He kind of shows this graph of the amount of income he's earned over years from game development. And it's got a 2-color slant going right through the diagonal. And the 2 colors are what ratio of that was his games versus the work he did for somebody else. Right? And so this is something where early on, all the income was coming from building somebody else's things, literally a day job at first, and then eventually 5 days of contract work, and then gradually 4 days of contract work, and then 3 days of contract work, and then today maybe a few hours here and there. Because most of the stuff instead comes from his IP, but what gave him the runway to do that, of initially a day a week or an evening a week, into 2 days a week, into 3 days a week, was accumulating business experience, customer reach, brand building, presence and connections, and relevant partnership opportunities, and that takes time. And so what I've often seen happen to people who did not juggle the outside income stream to maintain that runway is instead they burned through their savings until they realized that there were nowhere near enough savings for how long it was going to take to get that business off the ground. It's, of course, where that runway metaphor comes from. But that is why, even if you're taking that sort of 1, 2, 3 approach, there's often a gradient, right? Where before there's sort of a full studio, it helps to be doing some sort of contract gigs, finding how to navigate that space. And in the process, the other thing that also happens, right, is you're getting paid experience doing the art or the level design or the code or whatever side you maybe core specialize in, can learn a bit on somebody else's dime. And this is where you might be getting some experience, familiarity with how their other professional code base looks, with how their different processes, teams are structured, in ways that can help inform your sense in making better strategic decisions later on for the impact those might have on your choices. But again, it is typically not we're going to see no income or revenue until our game is a hit. No. If it's that we're going to release our first game and it's going to pay for all the later games, realistically, that is not something that typically happens. That is not usually the way this works out. So so disclaimer, right? I can only speak to my own personal experiences. There are other counterexamples I'm sure out there, as other people will say different things, but mine are coming from what I did, what I've seen work for others, from interviews and podcasts and things with other developers who are more recently involved in the mobile market. And in particular, speaking to trying to keep minimal development costs where you don't necessarily have outside venture capital or a big publishing partner. Without those, it becomes much harder to fight your way into the top 10 or 100 or 25. And without placement in those lists, the game it's released, but like nobody's playing it or seeing it. And maybe you can get like some comments or reviews or replies, but it's just a very different kind of thing in terms of not going to be a commercially sustainable activity, where if you're trying to build a studio, it is building a business, and a business is aiming to be repeatably profitable. That requires a longer arc than a single project, the first game that they happen to make. So then actually, to go back to my initial question of, so what kind of game to build, then my answer is to not think of it in terms of what's immediately profitable, but over the longer term, what's going to help best set you up to become profitable later. So that's what I'm talking about again, of acquisition of relevant customer reach, of positioning yourself for better partnership opportunities, of establishing muscle memory within your studio for the kind of games that you see that there's future market potential in working in. Those kind of considerations, I think, are more valuable at the first stage than thinking that the first game is going to be the source of profit. But anyway, I know there's a lot to throw at you. Thanks for listening. I want to throw it out there. It's a question we had surface on our forum that it's not usually what we focus on Home Team. We very much we focus a lot on step 2 of that 1, 2, 3. But it is such a common question and source of concern and source of rumors people heard in ways that they're seeing things that I wanted to offer a way to clarify it here that I can point back to in the future when people have this question. So of course, my answer on Slack is just going to otherwise scroll away as more chat and things happen in the weeks ahead. That's it for now. Thanks so much for following along. Also, we've had a lot of games get released recently from Home Team. In the past couple months, we've released 9 games, a tremendous variety of Godot and Unity and JavaScript. Encourage you, come practice your phase 2 with us in Home Team Game Dev. Build games together, meet new collaborators, practice your skills, build your way up, whichever direction you want to go in the future. And that's it for the day.